In this lesson, we'll look at the role of the hippocampus in a process called memory consolidation. We're going to use a diagram like this over here on the left, but let's just sort of unpack this a little bit. These three areas here would be regions of the cerebral cortex. So here we see the cerebral cortex of the human brain, and this little patch will represent visual cortex, this little patch will represent the touch cortex, and this little patch will represent the auditory cortex. Underneath the temporal lobe is the all-important hippocampus on both sides. So we've got two of them, but here's one of them pulled outside of the brain. And then we're going to be investigating the relationship between the cortex and the hippocampus and how the hippocampus plays a role in creating memories. Now, we know the hippocampus is important ever since the study of people like HM who had epilepsy, and he had surgery to treat epilepsy. They removed the hippocampus on both sides, and he was left with a profound memory impairment. He couldn't make new memories. So ever since patients like HM, we've known the hippocampus is critical in memory formation. So let's now tell the story of how memories are thought to be created in the human brain, and the hippocampus plays a starring role. First, we're going to have our two steps to memory creation. The first two steps, encoding and storage. And during the encoding phase of the learning process, a population of neurons is activated by the learning event. And this occurs in whatever regions of cortex are processing the learning event, but also the hippocampus, because these different sensory areas of the cortex send the results of their processing down into the hippocampus. There's convergence there. And so the hippocampus is going to make a memory trace that is linking the various activity in the different parts of the cerebral cortex. Now, the storage phase of this process we can identify as a subset of activated neurons grow stronger synapses, forming a memory trace. MT will be memory trace. And this is occurring both in the cortex and in the hippocampus. So whatever neurons were activated by the learning event, a subset of them are going to start to grow stronger synapses, and that forms a memory trace in the cortex as well in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is making a memory trace as well, and that memory trace is connected, if you will, to the cortical memory traces, because it was the cortical neurons that were sending information down into the hippocampus. Now, scientists think that as a result of this learning episode, we're left with relatively weak cortical memory traces and a strong hippocampal memory trace. Now, why the difference? And one way to understand this is in terms of plasticity. So the cortical memory traces are thought to be weak because cortical neurons possess lower plasticity. Remember, plasticity is the ability to grow stronger connections with activations. So if cortical neurons have low plasticity, then this one learning event will leave us with relatively weak memory traces. By contrast, the hippocampal neurons have high plasticity, and so we get a strong memory trace. And we're just showing that by sort of not very vibrant colors up here for the cortical memory traces, and then a vibrant hippocampal memory trace, a strong hippocampal memory trace. At the level of neurons, the idea is neurons with low plasticity, you need to activate them multiple times to really grow the synapses stronger. So after one learning event, you'll have relatively weak synapses. Whereas in the hippocampus, one learning episode can generate strong growth there. Lots of growth, strong synapses as a result of one learning episode. That's high plasticity. But here we have a little bit of a problem, right? So after all, it is the cortex that is our long-term memory storage area. And scientists think after one learning event, we have relatively weak memory traces here. Well, that's not going to be good enough, right? So we've got to have some way, the brain has to have some way of strengthening these cortical memory traces. So how does the brain strengthen those cortical memory traces? And recently, interestingly, there's a very important process discovered that happens during sleep. We'll call it memory consolidation. And this will be the process whereby the cortical memory traces are strengthened, and the star of the show will be the hippocampus. So this process of consolidation seems to operate like this. When we go to sleep, the hippocampal memory traces of the day's learning are reactivated. And that activity is the purpose of that activity seems to be to strengthen the cortical memory traces. Remember, these brain areas are linked. Initially, during learning, the cortical areas were sending information that converged down into the hippocampus to make a strong hippocampal memory trace. Well, now the information flow is in reverse. The hippocampal memory traces are turned on during sleep to activate the associated cortical memory traces. And the effect of that is to strengthen the cortical memory traces and link them together to represent one unified learning experience. What we saw, what we were feeling on our skin, what we were hearing, all gets strengthened, those memory traces, and linked together. So this is phase one, we'll say, of sleep, where we're doing memory consolidation. We're strengthening those cortical memory traces. Now, what's the evidence for this? Well, there have been really interesting studies with rats. So here's a rat up here on the left, and let's say it's going through some kind of maze or something. Maybe it's going to learn that there's food at the end or whatever. And here's the rat on one part of the apparatus. Scientists have inserted electrodes into the brains of these rats while they explore some environment, so they can record from individual neurons in the hippocampus or anywhere in the brain, really. So it turns out there are populations of hippocampal cells that seem to respond to a certain location that the animal is in. And if the animal moves to a new location, a different brain cell gets activated. And this record over here kind of shows this idea. So the animal's moving in this direction, and then here are different neurons that scientists were recording. And so when it's at this location, at a particular location, neuron number 7 gets really active, shown by the little marks here. And when it moves, it's neuron 6, and when it moves further, it's neuron 5 and 4, and you get this sequence of activity in different neurons as the animal moves through its environment. Now, what is shocking then is they just then let the animal go to sleep while still having the recording electrodes in the brain, recording from those same neurons. And what did they find? They found episodes during sleep where those same neurons were reactivated in the sort of same kind of sequence. It's as if the animal were replaying its earlier learning episode while it was asleep. So the idea then is, over here on the left, if we start off with a weak memory trace in the cortex, when we go to sleep and the hippocampal memory traces are fired up and send signals to the cortex to strengthen those memory traces, we get stronger cortical memory traces, and we're calling this process memory consolidation. And during this consolidation phase, the hippocampal neurons accelerate their firing by a factor of 20. So a single learning event during the day can be replayed hundreds of times during sleep. And so if you're reactivating those neurons in the cortex that were activated during the learning event, if you reactivate them a lot, you're giving them the opportunity to strengthen their synapses, to strengthen the memory traces. To use a computer analogy, during sleep, this memory consolidation process, we can think of it as the memories are being written to the brain's hard drive, and the brain's hard drive is the cerebral cortex. All right, let's take a pause here, an intermission, and when we come back, we'll look at another important event that happens during sleep, and then we'll discuss what the brain is doing when it tries to retrieve a memory. All right, so let's recap where we've been. We have the encoding and storage stage. So we have cortical regions responding to a learning event, and information is sent down. It converges into the hippocampus. A memory trace is formed there as well, linking the patterns of activity in the cortex. And we're left then with weak memory traces in the cortex due to low plasticity, but strong memory trace in the hippocampus due to high plasticity. Then when we go to sleep, we're going to go through this process of memory consolidation. We can think of it as sort of hippocampal replay. We replay the day's learning. We reactivate those memory traces. Signals are sent up to the related cortical memory traces to strengthen them and to link them together, forming a unified sort of memory of the learning event. It's now time to consider what scientists think happens after that. It's a very different kind of process. Those hippocampal memory traces that were just used to strengthen the cortical memory traces are now going to get weakened. Notice we go from bold printing here to not very, you can hardly see the memory trace here. So the idea is the memory traces are weakened. Now, why would the brain want to do this? To prepare the hippocampus for new learning. Consider it with a simple illustration here. Plasticity has limits. So during the day, if these are hippocampal neurons here, we got some baseline synapse strength at the start of the day, and then we learn a bunch of stuff during the day. Well, hippocampal neurons that are activated by whatever learning we're doing, they're going to grow stronger synapses. But we've got a problem. There's some maximum amount of strength that we can achieve during the day. So when synapses are maximally strengthened, no new learning can occur. Right? So the hippocampus has a limited number of neurons, limited number of synapses, and if we keep on learning stuff, we are going to be maxing out our synapses. If you get to the point where you can have no more synapse growth, then you can learn no more information. So during the waking stage, we have limitations. And when we go to sleep, then the idea is our brain has to reset those hippocampal synapses back to a baseline strength. So we have to weaken them again so that they can be ready for new learning. So you've got to restore the plasticity of hippocampal neurons, and sleep seems to be a time when we're doing this. So sleep has two important functions, to consolidate memories, but then also to refresh the hippocampus. Let's reiterate these two functions of the hippocampus during sleep with the following diagram. First, hippocampal neurons show high plasticity. They can grow strong synapses with one learning event. So here we have two hippocampal neurons among many in the hippocampus, but when we go through the day and learn stuff, what's happening in the hippocampus is that we're growing strong synapses between the neurons that were activated there with just one learning episode. You'll recall the cortical neurons have lower plasticity. Here we have high plasticity, fast growth to one learning event. And so as a result, that we're making strong memory traces of the day's learning. Now, the hippocampus then, we could describe it as a fast learner by day, and this puts it in a good position to be a teacher at night. And that's what we said was the process of consolidation. So we're going to use these strong hippocampal memory traces that were formed quickly with one trial learning, and we're going to use them to power the process of memory consolidation. We're going to strengthen the cortical memory traces using these strong, quickly formed hippocampal memory traces. But then in the next phase of sleep, we're going to weaken those hippocampal synapses again. So we're weakening the hippocampal memory traces. And why do this? To refresh the hippocampal neurons so they're ready to grow stronger synapses for the next day's learning. So we could say then that the hippocampal synapses, they have fast growth but also fast decay. So memory traces will decay quickly as a result of that phase of sleep. And this is why then we have to do that consolidation business before the hippocampal memory traces are weakened. So the hippocampus must teach the cortex before it forgets. Using a sort of a computer analogy, over here on the left, phase one of sleep, we're doing consolidation. So we're writing the data to the hard drive. We're saving the data in the cerebral cortex using that strong hippocampal memory trace while it lasts. But then in the next phase of sleep, we are going to go ahead and erase those hippocampal memory traces. Why do that? To refresh the hippocampus for new learning. We've got to weaken those synapses again so they can be strengthened again the next day. All right, let's wrap it up then with retrieval. So we have encoding and storage phase, then we strengthen the memory during sleep, call that consolidation, and now we're ready to retrieve. If we successfully strengthen those memory traces, and look, the writing here is more bold. In blue here, it's more bold than what we started out with. So we've got strong cortical memory traces. They've been linked together thanks to consolidation during sleep. So sleep strengthened the cortical memory traces. Our hippocampus is refreshed, so we don't have a strong memory trace down there anymore because during sleep, those memory traces were weakened to prepare for new learning. But that's okay, because now the cortical memory retrieval systems can successfully reactivate these strong cortical memory traces. And that's what retrieval is, the attempted reactivation of the memory trace neurons, recreating the pattern of activity during learning. And if our brain successfully consolidated these memories, now they become retrievable without the hippocampus. But what about right after learning? Well, let's follow what happens again using this diagram. So first study session, we're hearing things and we're seeing things, and that information converges in the hippocampus. We make a strong hippocampal memory trace that's linking what we heard and what we saw. And now, right after our study session, we try to retrieve it. Now, scientists think that the cortical retrieval systems are going to fail at retrieving the cortical memory traces directly because these are weak memory traces. However, the retrieval system will attempt to activate any related hippocampal memory traces. And remember, that one was strong. So now the idea is the reactivation of the hippocampal memory trace can then activate the associated cortical memory traces, and that becomes a successful reactivation. In other words, the hippocampal memory trace is being used to locate and reactivate the cortical memory traces, and we need the hippocampus at this time because the cortical memory traces are weak, and our cortical retrieval system would fail to activate the weak ones, so we need the assistance of the strong hippocampal memory trace to reactivate those cortical memory traces. So let's use this diagram again to illustrate what it's like then to have no hippocampus. Let's first take the left and the right diagram. First of all, on the left, if you're studying something and you're HM, your cortex is working fine. You can make weak cortical memory traces, but you can't link those cortical memory traces with a memory trace in the hippocampus. Right? So we can't integrate our experiences. We can't make a unified memory of our learning event. And furthermore, if we don't have a hippocampus, then we can't use our strong hippocampal memory traces to find and reactivate those weak cortical memory traces. So we're up a creek here. And then in the middle diagram, we're left with weak cortical memory traces, and evidently patients like HM, the cortical retrieval system just fails to be able to activate those weak memory traces. And so it appears to us like they can't make any new memories. Even though their cortex is intact, they should be making weak memory traces up there, but it's not sufficient for the retrieval systems to locate and reactivate. So without a hippocampus, then we have a fundamental problem in installing, in writing data to the cerebral cortex, the hard drive. So again, without a hippocampus, there are no hippocampal memory traces to use during sleep to consolidate memories in the cortex. If you don't have a hippocampus, you just don't have any memory traces of the day's learning that can be then used to strengthen those cortical memory traces. So our final conclusion then, that without a hippocampus, there is a fundamental failure to make new retrievable cortical memories. We're left with weak memory traces that the cortical systems cannot find or reactivate. And why is that? Because we don't have a hippocampus that can do the process of memory consolidation during sleep. We don't have any memory traces of the day's learning that can be replayed at night to strengthen the cortical memory traces, and so we're always left with weak memory traces that cannot be located and reactivated. So people without a hippocampus appear to us to be unable to make new retrievable cortical memories.